People don't appreciate how important GCSEs were to opening up the education system. It was a very small number of, it was a minority percentage of young people who did any education post 16 before GCSEs came in, and that unlocked education, sort of the next step of education for a huge number of young people. And it's one of the reasons I get so nervous when I hear people now say, oh, we don't need GCSEs, they've served their purpose, we've got education to 18, we can scrap them, we can go to some kind of 14 to 19 system which starts separating people out into vocational and academic. Again, I worry you could lose a lot of the benefits, even though obviously there are issues with GCSEs, there are things that could be done to improve them, but if you try to radically change that part of the system, you could find yourselves going backwards. But the bit I wanted to talk about, so what's next, is this 16 to 19. And I do think, on reflection, that bit of our system is pretty outdated. I think it's pretty restrictive and exclusionary. And we never really have the discussion about how to open it up. We just sort of accept the specialization of A levels as being a good thing, an English thing, something we've always done, without thinking about the consequences that it has for the wider system. What it means is that we're kind of stuck with only 40% of children being able to do A levels, and that figure hasn't really changed for quite a while now, and that's likely to always be the case unless we consider significant change post 16, just because they're very hard. It's very hard to do A-level maths because it's such a big part of your curriculum time. Whereas if you look at most countries, they will do a much broader range of subjects, 16 to 19, and that does mean that there's much more space for more young people to access that education. The other benefit of that is that you get a wider range of subjects being taken to a later point. I think we're one of the very few countries where maths is only compulsory to 16, where speaking your own language or studying your own language is only compulsory to 16. And I think that causes a lot of problems for for people in terms of their ability to engage in society, work, etc. beyond 18.
I agree with a lot of what Sam said. I certainly agree that we need to work on 16 to 19. I think some of what I was trying to say was aimed at that, though perhaps not as targeted as Sam's suggestions. So for example, I am very worried by the growing selectivity at 16 to 19 that Sam pointed to. I mean, my children went to 11 to 16 comprehensives in Cambridge because that's the form of mostly the form of school organization here. And then they went to a sixth form college.
Was it Hills Road, Peter?
I was just going to say, they went to the famous Hills Road. And when I tell people this, they say, oh, well, of course, Hills Road, But actually, entry to Hills Road requires Bs at GCSE, whereas entry to a lot of the sort of top London academies, where they have separate 11 and 16 admissions procedures, you need A's and A stars. So, and that's a novelty. And I think that's a really, really retrograde step, because as Sam says, not only is that recreating a hierarchy, it's just pushing it forward from 11 to 16, but it's also actually creating, hothouse schools, which I don't think are good for anyone, and depriving other 16 to 19-year-olds of a great opportunity. So the question is, well, how can you provide this warm and welcoming and inviting atmosphere at 16 to 19 where everyone thrives? I mean, there are a lot of different models. I mean, some people would like to champion 11 to 18 comprehensives, and some people do think that if you had something that was somewhere in between a sixth form college and a further education college, which is actually what Hills Road is in some ways, that might serve the purpose as well.
I think I agree with you that I don't think there's more work for us to do to define the role of local government in terms of democratic oversight of the local education system. I do agree with you on that. I don't think that means that trusts are not democratically accountable. I think they are democratically accountable. But I would agree that in relation to local democracy, that we probably need to do a bit more work. I don't believe that that means that local government needs to maintain schools. In part for this reason, local government doesn't maintain GP surgeries. Now, we wouldn't think that was a good idea. I don't think the public would think it was a good idea for local government to maintain GP surgeries. And why would we not? Why would we instinctively not think that was a good idea? Because GP surgeries are specialist organizations that require specialist clinical governance. Now, I think you can make a parallel there with education. I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, I think it's sensible education policy to set up organizations that are specialist organizations that really know how to improve schools, requiring specialist governance to run schools. Part of the work that we're doing about the positioning of school trusts as civic structures is to recalibrate that relationship with local government. So in the maintained system, there's a bit of a dependency relationship between local government and the schools that it maintains. In a system that I think we're moving towards, I think the relationship is much more like other civic institutions. So like universities, like FE colleges, for example, in the relationship they have with local government. And I think that's fine. I think that's a good adult to adult relationship, but it does require us to recognize that we must be good civic partners, and we must be partners in place. As place is fundamentally important. And I would agree with Peter's point that, more than 80% of trusts in the country are 5 schools or fewer. Many of them are, in fact, geographically proximate and in a place. And therefore that notion of the trust as an anchor institution in place and of a good relationship with a range of civic partners, including local government, feels to me like the way that we can recalibrate that relationship in a meaningful way.
I mean, one of the bees in my bonnet is my hunch that if you introduce any differentiation into English education, so as soon as if you were to bring in a sort of a more generalized degree, an American style liberal degree, if it were not the style of degree being offered at a handful of very old British universities, it would be seen as a lower class degree and therefore would basically fail. I'm quite suspicious of our ability to overcome the prejudices, basically, of the British people about wanting an old-fashioned education. Is that, I mean, as someone who's thought about this over a century, not that you've spent a century thinking about it, that, looking over the last century, do you think that's a fair?
I think people, they want the best education they can get. And so, yes, they tend to associate that with the one favored by elites. But actually, if you look at what's happened over the last 60 years, the range of subjects that people study is widened quite considerably. And in the 60s and 70s, when the swing away from science started, people were leaping in very large numbers into subjects like psychology and communications. And then, of course, we brought creative arts into the higher education system. And although they, of course, they have been stratified too, right? So everyone is now very determined to make creative arts be the sort of dumb subject that only kids from the poor schools do. Generally speaking, I think some of the new subjects have really thrived. So it's not impossible to shake up that traditional hierarchy. And the Higher Education Policy Institute just came out with a report about the crisis of the humanities, which I thought was doing just that. It was reinforcing the old hierarchy. Oh, look, people aren't doing history and English and classics. Disaster. But my response to that was, no, they're doing lots of different and new things, and that's to be celebrated, not to be complained of. So that's a sign, I think, that actually, in their behaviors, British people have been able to forge new, across new frontiers without, undue deference to the traditional hierarchy.